I had this big eureka moment about 12 years ago when I just went, it's not magic. In order to be an acupuncturist, I don't have to believe in magic. And actually it was a proper light bulb moment. And it was a moment that literally changed my life.
This podcast is supported by the British Acupuncture Council, who wish to encourage evidence-based discussions about acupuncture and its potential benefits.
Welcome to the ACU-Track podcast. Welcome back if you're not a first timer. As you can see, this isn't truly a podcast, as today we turn the cameras on. Today we're delighted to be welcoming Vivien Shaw. Vivien is an acupuncturist and anatomist who lives and works in Anglesey. For 10 years she's been researching the idea that the original acupuncture texts describe the physical human body rather than something more esoteric based on energy. The anatomist's job is to look at the body and then share that knowledge more widely. Vivien has used her unique combination of skills in both acupuncture and anatomy to first find out and then show what the original acupuncture texts are describing. Her work demonstrates a strong scientific basis for acupuncture that was developed through dissection and anatomical examination by early Han Dynasty anatomists over 2,000 years ago. Before we dive into the main event, here's just a few words from our sponsor, AcuPrime. Are you a practitioner practicing acupuncture, moxibustion, or cupping therapy? Are you looking for affordable and quality products? If you answered yes, then AcuPrime is your solution. AcuPrime is a UK-based online company which offers professional acupuncture and holistic medicine products. At AcuPrime, they believe in a world of well-being and interconnection. So search acuprime.com and join the AcuPrime community. And don't forget to use discount code ACU-Track N22 to get a 5% discount off your order. AcuPrime, excellence at sensible prices. Vivien, it's fantastic to have you with us.
Thank you for inviting me. It's great to be here.
Thank you, Vivien. Welcome. And you've brought to light some really interesting history relating to the development of acupuncture back in the Han Dynasty. But before we kick off with that, the big question that people get asked all the time when they first hear about acupuncture is, how does it work? What happens when you put a needle in? So just kind of maybe at a high level, can you maybe talk through, as an anatomist, talk through your slant on what you believe is happening when we put a needle into the body?
Okay, if you put a needle in, you have a neural response, you have a vascular response, you have a chemical response, you have a mechanical response, you have a lymphatic response, and all of those all happen every time you put a needle in.
Okay, because a typical part of acupuncture, which to some people seems a little implausible, is the old scenario where I've got a headache, stick a needle in your foot. So I think is what you're saying, that there's like a global effect as well as a local effect.
Yes, very much so. And I think a lot of the more unexpected results that you get from acupuncture are part of that global effect that you get. You know, if somebody's got a pain in their shoulder, and then you find a knot and you put a needle in the knot and you jiggle it around a bit, and then the pain in the shoulder goes away. That's easy to kind of understand. It's very intuitive. Whereas, as you say, if you're putting a needle in somewhere that's a long way away from where the pain is, but then the pain gets better, that requires a bit more explanation. Okay,
that's great. So back to the main event tonight. You, as part of your PhD, you've mapped these vascular pathways, these vascular the interesting landmarks. So maybe if you want to kind of rewind back a little bit in history, and where does this all come from?
So this is my favorite thing, has been putting together the science of the time and trying to find out where the acupuncture fits in with that. So the Han Dynasty was a bit like a renaissance. And there was a huge amount of science that was happening. They had universities, they created government, they unified China, and the development of medicine was part of that. So up until that point, people believed that if you were ill, it's because you'd been invaded by a bad spirit. And so the development of acupuncture was very much about, this is a physical body. We're going to explore the body. We're going to map the body. We're going to pay attention to everything that we find, and then we're going to manipulate the body. And there is evidence that there are records of dissection that come from that time. And so what I've been doing is I've been remaking the dissections, looking at the texts and asking myself, if I didn't know what I was looking at, if I didn't have an existing anatomy book, if I didn't have a teacher, if I was doing something that I was looking at things that nobody else had ever seen, because looking at the body was this rare opportunity, how would I make sense of it all?
Yeah, so I guess these days we're supported by all of this, hundreds of years of research, microscopes, electron microscopes, scanners, etc. And even to people that are not formally trained in any kind of medicine, people know quite a lot about the body. But when you're peeling back the skin for the first time and you've never seen inside a body, it must have been very different. I guess they wouldn't have seen the very fine detail. They probably didn't, may or may not have noticed the nerves. Maybe some areas they did, some areas they didn't. But what would have been the obvious thing that you think that they would have seen?
So the most obvious thing, I need to talk a little bit about what you see when you look at a cadaver. So these were people who were criminals. So they'd been executed, and part of their punishment was to be dissected. And so when you die, your heart is still pumping, and so you have blood in your veins, but your arteries are hollow. And then obviously you have nerves, and arteries, veins and nerves, by and large, they travel together. So you have this one vessel, let's call it vessel, that is full of blood. You have another vessel that is this tube that runs along with it. And then you have a third vessel that is dense and quite solid. And the three of them, they tend to move through the body as what we would call a neurovascular bundle. But if you're looking at that and you don't have the language for a neurovascular bundle, let alone the ideas that go behind that, then the blood vessel is obvious. It's got blood in it. You know about blood. Blood is the thing that keeps you alive. If you lose blood, you become weak. If you lose a lot of blood, you die. So you know that blood and life are intimately associated, and it's called the blood of life. Whereas what the purpose is of the hollow tube and the dense tube, you really don't know. But what you do know is that here you are looking at somebody who's dead, but their blood vessels are still full of blood. So there must be a second thing. There must be another thing that is involved in being alive, in being animate. And so the ancient Greeks thought that there was life force in the arteries because they were hollow.
That's right. Something must be in these hollow vessels.
Yeah.
Is it gone?
Yeah. The Chinese didn't say that. They just sort of talk about blood vessels and nerves and arteries interchangeably, pretty much. They just go the vessels.
The vessels.
And when you look at the ancient texts, there is this kind of clear progression where it looks as if from reading them, if you follow the ideas through, that there would have been sort of a phase of doing some dissection, doing some anatomy, and then you write the books. and then you have the discussions, and then you build on that, and then you go to the next phase and the next phase. So it wasn't like sort of in the modern world where every cohort of medical students learns the anatomy all over again. Here it would be a small group of anatomists whose speciality that was, who were probably at the imperial court, who had access to the criminals that had been executed, and then their job was to transmit that information more widely and share it with everybody else. And then everybody else made sense of it as they can.
As they could at the time. Okay, yes. So they've dissected these criminals as part of their punishment. They found these major vessels, and obviously they travel through the body. But how do we think, or how do you think that key areas, key points were converted into acupuncture points? You know, why did they pick on certain points?
So what I think is that they were looking for points of interest. So the analogy that I tend to use is of when people give you directions in the country, and they'll kind of go, you know, you turn left at the pub, and then you carry on down, and then there's a big cedar on the right, so you turn right there. That'll bring you up by the Rose and Crown at the village green, and then it's just up on your left. And there's no sense in there of how far it is in between things. But what people have done is they've given you the landmarks that you need in order to know where to turn. And so when you're reading the Chinese text, they're very, very terse, but they have that sort of similar feel to them, where what they've pulled out is where you have a branching, where you have, so there's a couple of points where a point goes, where a nerve maybe goes off on its own and leaves the neurovascular bundle. So you've got these whole sort of sways that go through the body where you've just got this big neurovascular bundle that's traveling along, and there's no real points on it.
This is a great analogy, the countryside directions, isn't it? Because that really is how these descriptions of the channels read. It's the obvious landmarks, ignore the detail on the long, boring stretch. It just goes on for however long someone's leg is, presumably, until you hit the bony part at the end.
Okay, Vivien, so they've located all these anatomically interesting areas, branches, maybe where the vascular vessels go around some bones or whatever. Now, it's fairly widely recognised that a good proportion of the acupuncture mechanism is neurological, and of course it's not just that. There are a number of other things involved. So I think earlier on you were saying that the obviously the blood vessels and the nerves travel roughly the same journey. So is it almost by luck that they've chosen these vascular locations, but also happens to be a neurological location, so something nerve related? Would you say that's the case?
So nerves and veins and nerves and arteries travel together, and veins, but not all the veins. But you know, every single nerve has a blood vessel with it throughout the whole body.
Of course, because it needs them for its own health.
Yeah. So you can't affect one without affecting the other. And so there's a record in the Book of Han, which is the official record of the Han dynasty, and it describes this dissection, and the last line of it and I'm paraphrasing here, goes something along the lines of and then you use fine bamboo in order to measure the length of the blood vessels in order to help to cure disease.
Right, so they definitely were focusing on using those areas.
Yeah, and so, you know, a lot of the time when you're looking at where the blood vessels go, and the other thing that is also relevant here is that the original texts that describe acupuncture, they talk about bloodletting and fine needles. So they talk about pointed stones, which are used for bloodletting, and fine needles, which are used for acupuncture. And the idea was that you would use them in tandem. So if you had a big excess of I don't know, stagnation or something like that. You would let blood, and then with the pointed stone, so that it was sort of, yeah, and then you would use a fine needle in order to do more finesse, more exquisite sort of balancing. And so this is very clearly, for them, what they were doing was manipulating the flow of blood.
And just to give this conversation a bit more context, I think it's important to note the channels and the meridians, certainly more in the kind of modern Western world, have been talked about quite a lot in almost esoteric or metaphysical terms, that they're these energetic channels that, subtle matter, that kind of thing. But really, one of the essential points of your thesis is to emphasize that the ancient Chinese were mapping very real anatomical structures. That is what they were doing. That they were not speculating about esoteric pathways of subtle energy. These are very real vessels that you can dissect, that you can see, that you can manipulate.
Yeah.
And I think that's just such a key point to get over. And really, one of the most interesting things about your thesis is that you went down body by body, channel by channel. You took the ancient descriptions, you did the dissections, you saw the similarities.
Yeah, I think for me, one of the greatest, I had this big eureka moment about 12 years ago, when I just went, it's not magic. In order to be an acupuncturist, I don't have to believe in magic. And actually that it was a proper light bulb moment. And it was a moment that literally changed my life. From that point onwards, I learned science, I learned biology, I retrained as an anatomist. I ended up as a lecturer in medical science in anatomy at Bangor University. I worked in Oxford. I wrote papers. I have lost track of the amount of dissections I've done. And it is very much. And I think that, coming back to this thing of like, not everybody did dissection, not everybody got to see. There is also a whole world in which, if you are a practitioner of Tai Chi or Qigong, so you do exercises to move your Qi, you feel it. So for many people, their felt experience of their own Tai Chi practice is that they feel what they call Qi or energy moving in their body. And so it doesn't in any way negate that, but there is a definite, clear physical substrate that was the process of mapping. And when you look at acupuncture books, when they're talking about meridians and points, they call them atlases, in the same way that Gray's Anatomy is an atlas, and it just literally it is.
So I think, Vivien, we've got some rather wonderful slides that you produced. Now, these aren't necessarily for the faint-hearted. They're true cadaverous dissections, but I think it's worth talking through some of the interesting points. Now, to an acupuncturist, we'll be talking about specific acupuncture points. For those that are non-acupuncturists, then so maybe this is where you can just learn a little bit about where on the body we choose to put needles.
So this is a slide of spleen 6 and stomach 36. It's a point combination that is regularly used. If you're a patient, you may well have had this experience yourself. And when you look at the slide, on the left-hand side, you've got a picture of a dissection that I did. This one has been turned into an illustration for me by a friend called Ken. The actual structures that are in there are real. This is just a dissected foot, and in a later slide you'll see the actual dissection without the illustration. And then on the right hand side you've got a picture that's taken from the front and the back, or an illustration from the front and the back of a lower leg. And stomach 36 is marks, it's just below the knee on the outside of the leg, and spleen 6 is just above the ankle on the inside of the leg. And so if you look at it from the front, what you have is you have this big femoral artery. So the artery, the nerve, and the vein come over the pelvic together, and they come down through the thigh on the inside of the leg, and they kind of curl around and go and tuck into the back of the knee. So if you're looking on the diagram, you can sort of see shaded behind, you've got the kneecap at the front and some arteries, and then at the back you can sort of see sort of shaded out, because it's running down the back, you can see the main artery that's going down. And then it has a branch that comes up through in between your fibula and your tibia. So tibia is the shin bone, you've got a space in between them, and stomach 36 is the point at which your artery is coming from the back of your knee through that space to the front. So it's the first place where you're able to affect it. So if you put a needle in at that point, then you can directly affect the artery. In the lower leg, the nerve travels with it. So this is the nerve that will allow you to curl your toes up, to bring your foot up towards you, dorsiflex, and that artery and that nerve, they run completely together. So they both come through together, and then they carry on down together on the outside of your shin. At the same time, the veins that are in the lower leg, they're not specific veins, there's just a lot of veins that travel with it. So here you really have got this sort of clump of artery, nerve, vein that's kind of just, you can just see that there's blood coming down with the hollow tube and the closed tube, the dense tube.
So this is really interesting, Vivien. So I think what you're saying here is that stomach 36 is the first point here where you're kind of getting direct, close access to that tibial artery.
But so and I think the really important thing here is like, this is the main blood supply in the leg. So you can sort of feel the pulse over your groin, just where it comes through, and then it disappears in the whole of your thigh. You can't get to it at all. And here it's coming back out again, and you can feel it again, or you can find it again. You don't get a pulse there, but you can find it.
That's great. And just for some context there, maybe for listeners who aren't acupuncturists, interestingly, that there are a lot of important points around stomach 36, and just below that knee line, gallbladder 34 is another one. There's a lot of important points around there, but actually some of the key acupuncture points we use aren't really on the thigh.
No.
They start below the knee. That's where they were more interested in. And why is kind of a question, but really looking at it through this lens, this makes a lot more sense to me about why they were potentially interested in that area, and why they saw it as a window of opportunity almost to work with something physiologically there.
Yeah, I mean, so the first points that are listed are there are points on the back, but then there are also a sort of series of 6 points that start at your finger or on your toe and end at the elbow or at the knee, and they're all around the joints. So they're all at the places where you can affect the structures that lie inside. And then certainly, once you get into the upper arm or into the thigh, then it's all really deep inside, and you can't get to it anymore. And so you can see this again if you look on the picture on the left of spleen 6. So spleen 6 is the same thing. You've got this main blood vessel. So you've got the anterior tibial artery, which has got stomach 36 on it, and you've got the posterior one, which carries on down, and it sits right inside your calf, travels right down the back of your tibia, back of your shin, and then it sort of pops out just on the inside of your leg above your ankle, and then it curls under your instep and onto the underside of your foot. So by putting a needle into stomach 36 and spleen 6, you have simultaneously stimulated both of these two main arteries that feed your lower limb, and any effect that you have is going to then transmit back up through the leg and into the body. And if what you believe, as is part of Chinese medicine, that what you do by particular kinds of stimulus is you affect tonification, then what you're doing is you're kind of geeing up the blood. And you're geeing up the biggest blood vessels that you can get access to.
Absolutely, at the clear anatomical access points for those blood vessels.
Yeah,
I think Vivien, that's absolutely fascinating. Maybe there's another one we should look at. Okay,
so on the right hand side, you've got the same picture that you just saw of the foot, but from the underneath, and then the picture that's just below it is the actual dissection that hasn't been turned into an illustration. And so what we're looking at here is that if you follow the artery on the top, so if you look at the picture on the bottom, there's an artery that runs along the top of your instep, and then it goes in between the space between the first and the second toes, and it dives down through and it comes out on the underside. And so you have this kind of this loop of blood that happens. So you've got, so I sort of said that if you've got stomach 36, you've got your anterior tibial artery. If you've got spleen 6, you've got your posterior tibial artery. So the anterior one runs over the top of your foot, the posterior one curls under your instep, and then the two of them meet up. The anatomical word for it is an anastomosis. But so you've got this loop, which is a really really significant anatomical sort of feature. And so kidney 1 is on the bottom part of this loop, and it's a point that if you do Tai Chi, you'll be very familiar with. It's called bubbling spring, and it's the place where you connect with the earth, and in that kind of imagery, and where the chi kind of starts to rise up from this bubbling spring. And then the point on the top that's just the other side of the foot is called chong. It's a pulsing a sort of vigor. It's a point of vigor. And liver 3 is something that you use in order to really control the chi. So Spod, earlier you were talking about, if you've got a headache and then sometimes you put a point in the foot, this will be one of those points. And the idea is it's a really big key anatomical feature that if you use it right will allow you to have a global effect.
And if to the non-acupuncturists out there, you can quite easily locate liver 3 if you just put your finger between your big toe and the next toe, slide your finger up the foot, so you actually gone beyond the toes, up onto the top of the foot, and you can feel you're between a couple of bones and some tendons. You can feel it there, and if you kind of very gently poke around with your fingertip, you'll feel it's really sensitive. And that you know, if you were back in the Han dynasty and you've found this point anatomically, and then you start poking your own foot, you'd be going, wow, there's something going on there.
Yeah. And so then the picture on the left is of the same thing in the hand. It's a bit less clear, but if you look at the bottom picture, you can see your radial artery. So your radial artery, it's where the doctor will take the pulse, but then it doesn't go straight into the hand. It comes and it curls around your wrist onto the back of your hand, and it goes in at the point that we call colon 4. So colon 4 is the point at which, in the same way that liver 3 goes down and meets up anastomosis with kidney 1 in the foot, here you've got colon 4 is going down through, and you can see on the picture of the palm of the hand that's above it where it comes through into the palm. And one of the things that we did when we were making this dissection in order to make it a bit clearer, is we filled the artery with dye. So you can see it's red in the bottom picture, and you can see like little threads that are going off along the wrist and into the hand. And then on the inside of the palm, you can see where it's got dye in the artery. And the other artery that comes into the hand that runs on the side of the little finger is the ulnar artery. That's the one that's at the top of the picture that's being held up and out of the way to let you see what's underneath. And so that means that then if you, on the one hand, you are manipulating liver 3, which as Spod rightly said is very, very sensitive. And on the other hand, you'll also find colon 4 is quite sensitive. And they both have this singular feature. It's the only place in the body where this happens. You have this singular feature of making a loop that goes round. Then you have this huge global effect.
This is absolutely fascinating, isn't it? And again, for those of you who aren't practitioners who may not be aware, liver 3 and colon 4, this is possibly the most common, well-known acupuncture point combination there is. So we're not just picking some random points here, are we, Vivien? These are points that were consciously, deliberately used together throughout Chinese medical history.
Yeah, somebody described them once as being Valium. Yeah, you use them to calm and smooth.
And they're both at these points where the blood vessels almost do this loop or this kind of slingshot effect and go back round. So you're clearly tapping into some unique physiology.
It's one of the things that when you're doing science, you've got a side of science that's about just observation. So this is what anatomy does a lot of. You look, you identify, you name. And then once you've like identified and named, then you have to have a theory about what it does. And then based on the theory of what you think it probably does or might do, you create an experiment in order to test that out. So if your theory, if after you've done all your dissections, you've made your map of the body, then you're looking at all the different bits of it. The choice of points is not random here. They've deliberately chosen 2 points that have the similar sort of unique piece of anatomy and gone, okay, what happens if I needle these 2 points that are so similar together? What will the impact be? And then when you come back and you have patient after patient that is feeling calmer, is feeling like that their stress levels have dropped, you go, okay, what I've then done is in some way, shape or form, I have smoothed their chi. I have created this sort of global sense of relaxation. And then what makes sense then is that I have done that by controlling and smoothing the flow of the blood and the chi together.
So we've used the chi word. So I think that is so it's always a tricky one because people associate the word chi with some magical fluid that only acupuncturists can see, and it's clearly not a real thing. But I think what we're saying is chi is the name they gave to their understanding of physiology in those days. So chi is still there, but we've broken chi down into neurology and all the other sort of mechanisms that go on in the body.
Yeah, I think, if you get 20 acupuncturists and ask them, well, what chi is, you'll get 20 different descriptions. But ultimately, certainly my take on it is that, that thing that must be as well as blood, that must animate, that is chi. And for me, chi is just a catch-all term that describes all of those things that we know must be there, must be true, because we can see the effects of it, but we can't see it. So one of the things that has really defined modern medicine is the invention of the microscope. And we get to see in smaller and smaller and smaller detail. And the more we see in smaller detail, the more descriptions that we can give and the more theories we can create about how the body works that are based on having that tool. But when you have your eyes and you have your experience, then that's what your tool is. So you can see the effects, but you can't see how it works. So for example, one of the things that people say about the small intestine is that it separates the pure from the impure. And when you think about it, in the small intestine, you have a membrane. So you have food that's going down on one side of the membrane. And then we now know, thanks to the microscope, that you have the molecules from the food are taken across the membrane and go into the blood, and so then become part of the body, whereas the rest of the food, the waste, then travels back out. So it literally is that separation of the pure, so the stuff you can use, from the impure, which is the stuff that you lose. But it's a metaphor, it's an analogy, because until you've got the microscope, you can't look at a basal membrane of a small intestine.
No, so they were just working with their understanding, and they built a framework around their understanding of the human body and how it worked. And it's that framework that they carried forward, and that became acupuncture, I guess. Yeah.
So I think, you know, they made their map of the body. They started to develop theories about why putting needles in would work. And, you know, coming back to the broader context of Han era China, some of the biggest engineering feats of that time were around the creation of canals and irrigation systems. And so they had this really deep understanding of how you control flow of fluid, of water from that. And, you know, you could, and there are some passages within the ancient text that explicitly make that connection with the canals and the rivers of that time. You know, so it's really not that big a stretch to think that they were going, okay, if I have a river and it's in flood, if I want to control it, I do this. If I want to make it smooth, I do that. If there isn't enough, then I bring some more in. That they're applying the same kinds of analogies to the human body and the fluid in it.
At ACU-Track, we are passionate about helping practitioners engage in research. One of the best ways to start is by collecting evidence in your own clinic. The ACU-Track system easily allows you to monitor your patient outcomes and improvement by using patient outcome questionnaires online. Our system helps you save time in clinic by sending questionnaires and intake forms to patients remotely via email. You can monitor progress for a wide range of health complaints, including pain, well-being, and mental health. By systematically auditing your practice, you can quickly build up a large body of validated outcomes data for your patients. You can use this data to let prospective patients know what your results and success rates are for particular conditions. You can also use this data to communicate with your local GPs and healthcare providers to help you get referrals and build a more successful practice. We also have some very cool clinical notes-taking features designed specifically for acupuncturists on the system as well. We have discount codes available for members of professional associations. So if you are interested, please visit our website to learn more, www.acu-track.org, helping you turn anecdotal reports of effectiveness into validated data.
We've got another great slide here.
Okay, so one of the new ideas that they had was around circulation. So it's not circulation as we know it, Jim. This is circulation Chinese style. So this is what they described it as. It's a continuous circulation, like a ball of string. And on the left-hand side of the slide, what you have got is an angiogram of a hand. And the way that that's made is you get dye. So it's a bit like the cadaveric picture that I showed you earlier, where we injected dye into the into the arteries. So they've done the same thing, only this is obviously a living person. So you inject dye, and then you take an X-ray, and the dye shows up on the X-ray. And what you can, and on the right-hand side of the picture, you've got a picture of somebody's face where they've drawn onto her all of the arteries and the what are called terminal arteries. So they're the points where the arteries end. And so again, there are passages within the ancient texts where they talk about this sort of endless circulation where you move from one meridian to the next. And most of the meridians end at the periphery. There's a couple that that end in the middle of the body. I'll talk about those in a minute, but certainly the ones that end at the periphery, you have these terminal arteries, and they're very, very fine. You can find them on a dissection. You can see them quite clearly. But again, you know, you're talking about somebody where there's only blood in the veins. There's not blood in the arteries, and you don't have a microscope, so you can't see capillaries. So all you can see is that the meridian eventually ends up in the fingers or the toes, or on the face. And then there are a couple where the meridian will end up in the body, but there again, you've got sort of a link, a vascular link between the end of that artery or that meridian. So like the spleen meridian ends up sort of over your ribs, but then you've got a nerve and an artery that run along your ribs that come up into your armpit. And so you have that connection again there. And so this is, again, it's this idea of there is a physical connection. And related to that, they also had a concept of a body clock that fits with which meridian follows which order.
And this is a pretty sophisticated observation for over 2,000 years ago, isn't it, Vivien? I mean, they're talking that they're understanding the body as a circulatory system. They're understanding the circadian rhythm in a sense, aren't they? I mean, that's certainly, at the very least, they're identifying something of that quality.
Yeah. And I think, you know, and it sort of ties in as well with the main diagnostic tool that you had, other than sort of talking to people and seeing their symptoms, was the pulse. You know, there's a huge amount of significance and value placed on being able to listen to somebody's pulse. And in Chinese medicine, there are different positions on each side. So you've got a place where you can effectively kind of listen to each of different areas of the body. And when you read the text, it's like the pulsing isn't associated with the heart. The pulsing is associated with the breath. So you've got you're timing everything to fit with the breath. And again, when you look at a cadaver of somebody who's died in a sort of agitated state, then the last thing that happens is that the heart is in systole, it squeezes. So the ventricles squeeze and the atria are open. And so what you end up with is a muscle where the bottom of it is kind of closed shut, and then the back, which is associated with the lungs, is going to be full of blood. So you've got in the right atrium, you've got blood that's coming from the main blood vessel that runs through your body, the vena cava, that's the main vein. And then in the back, you've got the left atrium, which is connected into the lungs. So you've got the blood vessels that are in the lungs, in the back of the heart, as effectively one large chamber. And then you've got the large vein that's going up and down the body through the center. You've got the main vena cava that's running up through the body. And then sort of you've got the picture of the heart that's obviously in the chest. And so there's a blue part to it on that picture of the heart. And most of the body of the heart is yellow. but the vena cava, so the right atrium of the heart, is that blue part. And so it's like you've got one continuous big fat vein that then has a pouch on the right hand side of the heart. And what you can't see on this picture is the lungs and the association with the lungs. So you're just going to have to take my word for it. But if you look at the lungs, you have bronchi and arteries and veins are all traveling together. So if you think, what allows you to extract oxygen is that you have a little alveolus, a little pocket, and again you have this invisible diffusion across a membrane into the bloodstream, and so that close association is just as much there in the lungs as it is elsewhere. So you're just seeing that the lungs are full of blood, really, really, really full of blood.
And what we're seeing here as well in this side, Vivien, is another major channel in Chinese medicine and acupuncture, the Chongmai, and I think a pretty obvious correlation with the aorta and the vena cava. Yeah.
So again, when you're looking at the texts that describe this particular meridian, it's described as the reservoir of blood or the sea of blood. It's on the right hand side of the body. This is it's in the trunk. It's on the right hand side of the body. And interestingly, coming back to the conversation about circulation, where you have points that are at the ends of arteries, here, if you look on here, you can see like little purple dots. So
that's right, some on the hands and the feet, and then up there by the mouth and even the pelvis.
Yeah, and then on the top of the head. So the ones on the top of the head, around the mouth, on the fingers and on the feet, they're again, mostly they are either going to be on places where you've got a pulse or where you've got a terminal artery or terminal artery, terminal vein.
So they're kind of mapping the extremities of that big, large system.
Yeah, and they're pulling out the big points, and the one that's on the pelvis is over the femoral artery. So again, it's this huge pulse. It's a really significant pulse that gets mentioned over and over and over again.
And all these points are named Chong.
Yeah, they all
hence the link there. I mean, there is absolutely no doubt when you're looking at that picture, Vivien, that is what they were talking about. They couldn't possibly have meant anything other than the vena cava and the aorta and that system.
Yeah. And, there's texts that explicitly say we did dissection, we measured stuff. There's no reason at all to think that that's anything other than the boring truth. but then there still remains that work to do of like going, okay, what did they decide was important to describe? And it's not necessarily the same things that we think is important to describe. A lot of it is the same because blood vessels, nerves, they're interesting.
That's right. But they had their own interesting slant on it, didn't they? And they saw maybe some connections that we miss in modern anatomy or modern medicine, or that we sort of dismiss or don't find as interesting as they did, such as that anastomosis between the points on the hand and the foot. You mentioned earlier, Vivien, that again some of the most important points are on the between the knees and the feet and the elbows and the hands, and that the other largely important group of points in acupuncture are actually on the back.
So there are a series of points that are on the back, and again, if you're a patient, you probably had these done at some point. Every acupuncturist uses them quite a lot, and they map onto, or they're named after different organs usually. There's a couple of others in there as well, but the earliest ones, they just did the 5 what are called yin organs, so the heart, the lungs, the heart, the liver, the spleen, and the kidneys, and they are sort of roughly in the right position. But if you and quite often people sort of associate them with the level of nerves, but actually, so the nerves that run through your spinal cord are by and large to do with the periphery, making your hands and your limbs work, and giving you sensation back. You do have the sympathetic chain, which runs either side of the spine, but it's not the whole story by any means. But actually, we're back in 2,000 years ago, where there was no concept of the nervous system, none. There was this additional animatory force, but it was lots of different things, that idea of what it was, of chi. But here, what you can see on the left is, so this is a picture of a heart. And so the first one that you get is for the lung, and that one is level with this big, here it's called the left innominate vein. We normally call it the brachiocephalic vein. So it's sort of directly at that level. The next level down, you can see here, these are this pulmonary artery, and these are the pulmonary veins. So these are going out to the lungs. And so the point that's sort of for the heart is at the same level as this big sac that I talked about at the back, the left atrium. It's at that level. It's a broad area, but it's at that level. So then here you've got, so this is vena cava, this is the superior part, this is your right atrium, and here's your inferior part. So that little stubby bit there matches up with that stubby bit there. You've got a big liver, and above it,
we see the liver there, right at the top on the right hand side in the sort of brown shade.
Yeah. And then you've got that same little stubby bit that sticks out above the liver, and obviously there is a diaphragm in between. So the diaphragm is sitting in between the heart, with the heart and the lungs above it, and then the liver and everything else below it. So the picture on the right is not anatomically particularly accurate, but the point of it was, the point of it was that, so then your next point on the back, the one that corresponds to the liver, is at the same level as the veins that are coming out of the liver here. And then the next one down, you've got the spleen, and that's the point where the esophagus, the esophagus, the tube that the food goes down, goes through the diaphragm. And then the one below that is level with where the kidneys are, with the veins for the kidneys. So at each point, they've chosen this sort of major landmark that locates where the points are with the organ that they're correlated with.
Really, really interesting. And Vivien, as you said earlier, yes, there are nerve connections that come out the spine that innervate those certain organs, or partially innervate those organs. But when you're dissecting a body 2,000 years ago, that's presumably more difficult to see. And like you said, they didn't have that sort of level of understanding in the nervous system. But what we're seeing here, this is a more obvious link, isn't it? This is the blood supply to and from each organ at the level at which they ascribed that point to be related to and affecting the function of that organ system.
Yeah. And the part of the nervous system that they did see and did describe was what we call the vagus nerve. So the vagus nerve, it wraps around the esophagus and it's sort of like this tangle of string almost, and then it comes down with the esophagus, it comes down into the abdomen and then spreads out to the organs from there. And that's giving you your sort of rest and digest, the parasympathetic supply. And that sort of bag of that tangle of string is described in the texts. And actually the spinal cord is also described, but not in relation to these particular points. Those descriptions come later.
I'm finding this really interesting because having needled the BAcC points, these points we're talking about, hundreds and hundreds of times, and always thought of the names of them, kidney, spleen, etc., to be more conceptual than physical. But you look at this and you can see directly, you're putting a needle in, and you can see how you could be then influencing the blood supply to that organ.
Absolutely. I mean, that's what I see. And it has, you know, this anatomical knowledge and this understanding and this sort of search to try and understand what were my long dead colleagues looking at. That has it's changed the way that I choose points. It's changed the way that I needle. You know, I always have in my mind now, whenever I'm deciding what to do with a patient, where does the blood supply go?
Absolutely. So really, we're coming from this wonderful, you know, almost theoretical re-examination of theory and the history of medicine into how has this information been relevant to your clinical practice, Vivien? Could you just expand about that? That's really interesting. What have you refined your point location, presumably as a result of this, where you locate points, how you stimulate them?
Yes, I mean, I do have a very particular kind of take on the body, in that I've seen so many of them, and that I've, you know, done the dissections. So I can see in my mind's eye, I can look at somebody and I can sort of see what lies underneath. And so I do now very much kind of, I just take the nerves occasionally. If I'm treating somebody for a neurological disorder, you know, if somebody comes in and they've had chemotherapy or something and they've got neuropathy as a result, I will kind of sit there and go, okay, which nerves? Obviously. You know, but then I will choose the points that stimulate the blood supply and the nerve together. I use a lot more moxa now, so this herb that you burn in order to create warmth, because again, in the texts, they use the moxa and bloodletting and needling are kind of a trilogy that they use together in order to either stimulate or reduce or fine tune. And the moxa is the thing that you use to warm and to stimulate. And if you think about, I don't know, if you've got a pan with water and you put a gentle flame underneath it, or just warm it gently. So that's an analogy that has come as a result, for me, has come as a result of doing this work, of doing this research.
And of course, heat is a vasodilator. We know it's going to expand the blood vessels, it's going to improve circulation, any kind of warmth. So again, the emphasis that you've seen from the classical text on the blood flow and regulating and creating this harmonious blood flow in the body has then lent you to go and think, right, well, how can I maximize that for my patients?
Yes.
So Vivien, after your thorough and fascinating research here and connecting the dots and looking at these real anatomical structures and pathways that the ancient Chinese were describing, what's the next steps here in this journey of exploring the channel system? Are there any avenues where you think acupuncture research could learn from this and could move forward? And as practitioners, what are the obvious next steps for us in terms of translating this knowledge to try and get better results in our practice? Maybe you've just got some thoughts on where you would like to see this information lead the profession of acupuncture.
So I think for me, one of the biggest areas of learning is that a huge amount of the research focuses on, as Spod said right at the beginning, on neurology, on where the nerves, you know, you've got functional MRI, you're looking at the brain, you know, if you put a needle in, what lights up, that sort of thing. And my perception of of what happens in the body is that nothing happens alone. So to me, it's a bit like if you have a herb, if you have a herbal medicine, then the herbal medicine is innately complex. You know, you have a whole sort of panoply of things that all happen within that herb, all at the same time when you take it. And when you're making a pharmaceutical drug, you look for the active ingredient and you pull the active ingredient out and you go, there you go. And you turn that into a pill and you lose the rest of the herb. And with it, you lose the complexity, and quite a lot of the time you maybe lose some of the things that will ameliorate the effect, or, you know, so you end up with a very, very potent single ingredient that gives you massive side effects. Whereas if you took the whole herb, your body will be able to absorb it and use it much better, and it will be more measured. And
so we've potentially, with the neurological emphasis on these acupuncture mechanism studies, we've potentially been doing the same thing with acupuncture, just over focusing on looking at these neurological effects and signaling pathways, and just taking that one bit of the effect rather than that big picture physiology.
That's what I think is one thing. And, you know, it's part of the way that our way of doing science works, is that you want to choose a thing that you study, that you isolate, and that you control. And so to actually make the way that you look at what happens when you do acupuncture more global, more holistic. And that's a really, really difficult thing to do. And there are innate problems with physiology, with exploring physiology, because to do anything other than nerves, you kind of have to use an animal model.
Absolutely. And it's this is really true to the spirit of the medicine, really, and certainly how the ancient Chinese saw the body. They did look at interlinked systems, and like you say, in the body, it doesn't just work with one system. These neurovascular bundles are neurovascular bundles for a reason. You can't have one without the other. They flow in the same way. So for the acupuncture mechanism researchers out there listening, take your head out of the nervous system for just 1 second and make sure you don't forget the blood flow and the other things, and potentially look at some other markers. What about some interesting vascular markers that we could be looking for if we're trying to emphasize the blood flow and circulation here? Are there any, you know, obvious biomarkers there, or, you know, or
O2 saturation?
Okay.
Oxygen saturation is one of the most obvious ways to go. And, you know, there's a real irony in the fact that if you're looking at functional MRI, what you're actually looking at is blood, you know, and you're using the movement of, actually what you're looking at is iron in the blood. and where do you get more iron? So, and the iron is obviously carrying the oxygen, so, you know, you have these spikes of oxygen that's being carried through the blood, and that's taken as a proxy for neural activity. And so my question then is like, well, what happened? Do we know if by stimulating distally, if there is a way in which that creates higher oxygen saturation, which it probably does? Is that also a marker in some way? I don't know, but there are so many more questions that could be asked. And it's about the neurovascular coupling, particularly, that you know, those are the questions that really, I think, are the very interesting ones going forward.
Yeah, fantastic. That makes absolute sense. And then more from the sort of practitioner lens as well. I mean, I've got a very obvious question straight off the bat. Should all acupuncturists be attending dissections as part of their training?
That would be very difficult to arrange. I think
we're going to give you a big magic bag of cash.
I think the question is, would we all benefit? I think that's probably the question, isn't it?
The cash is there. It's a big magic bag of cash. I would have loved the opportunity to have done that as part of my training, but it wasn't there. I know some colleagues have had the opportunity to do it, but I just think from what we've seen, what you would learn from that would be absolutely invaluable.
Yeah. And I think, not everybody would want to go, but I think, for the people for whom this is an area of interest, for me, at the point where I first trained, it wasn't an option. And then it became something that you could choose to do. And I jumped at it, and I jumped on it, and I jumped on it, and it cost me loads of money, and I missed afternoons at work and everything in order to learn. And
well, the rest of the professional benefit from your sacrifices there, and choosing to go down this rabbit hole. Vivien, this has been an absolutely fascinating conversation. I think this is of quite essential importance. And one other point I think I will make is that acupuncture, one of the chief criticisms of acupuncture historically by the skeptical conventional medical establishment has been that it doesn't have a solid basis in anatomy and physiology. And I mean, I think we can almost say that is just incorrect now at this stage with what we know, what your research has shown, that is just absolutely not true. So I think to emphasize this point that acupuncture is about real anatomy, it's about affecting real physiological changes at specific anatomical points of interest. I think that's something as a profession that we should be cheering and celebrating.
Thank you.
Fantastic. I'm sure there'll be plenty of our listeners out there who are keen to look at Vivien's work. I urge you, go and read her papers. They are brilliant. And what you have in there is you've got a diagram of all the channels. You've got the descriptions of the channel pathways from the classics. And then you've got images of Vivien's own dissections that she did as part of her PhD all alongside it. So we're going to put the links to all Vivien's papers and her website in the show notes page. So definitely, please go and check out her work. It is an absolutely brilliant read, and you can go step by step through all the different channels that she's dissected and studied. Vivien, this was absolutely brilliant. Thanks for coming on. I'm certainly looking forward to my next patients tomorrow morning with maybe a bit more of a refined lens on the blood vessels and where I'm putting those needles.
Thank you.
Thank you, Vivien.
It's been a real pleasure.
Well, that's all for this episode. We hope you enjoyed your journey today. Please like and subscribe, and we'll be back soon. And don't forget to visit our website at acu-track.org.